computer.
Okay, yeah. So, as he was mentioning, yeah, I'm a journalist by profession, but I have always long had an interest in the Civil War, have a very deep interest in history, and for reasons that will come out in the Q&A session, I think. Uh, I decided to write a biography about this guy, who I think was one of the most fascinating persons as a person, as a personality in the war. It just what his personal history was coming to the United States. Through Europe, through the Middle East, through Africa, through the Caribbean, and in order to fight in the Civil War. So hang on just one second. Got it? Okay. So this is Nicholas Said. I colorized this, but this was his 1863 photograph for the 55th Massachusetts. He joined the 55th as soon as he could in the war, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But where he came from was the country of Borno in Central Africa. There was a time at which Borno, from the 1400s to the 1600s, it was founded 1,000 years ago. It was founded back around 800 AD or something. There was a time when it was one of the biggest nations in Africa. It filled what was a combined, if you would put the United Kingdom and Spain, it was about that size of country. Nicholas Said was born Muhammad Ali Ben Said because this was a Muslim nation. He was, and this is about the size of the country when he grew up. It had been severely chopped down because of famine and revolution and invasion and a few other things, but it was still a fairly sizable country at that time, and one of the more important places to go on the trading routes through Africa. He grew up in the capital of the country, Kukawa, which was founded in 1814, replacing a capital that had been around since about 250 years before that. His father was a general of the leading general of the Borno army. They would ride into battle with coats of chain mail, with swords and shields and spears, looking like they rode out of the Arabian Nights. They had, there were some muskets that they would use. They had a couple of cannons, but frankly, they decided that the spears and arrows and before the repeating rifle, spears and arrows were pretty good competition for muskets. And so, they preferred the spears and arrows. And this was his army. Had several thousand men in the army. This is the Sheikh of Borno who ruled the country. And this is a very wealthy woman in Borno, had a lot of wealth, had a lot of poverty, but there was a lot of wealth of wealthy families attended to by servants and slaves. Which we'll get into because slavery was a very important part of the Borno economy, as it was in many kingdoms in Africa at the time. Because he was born in a wealthy family, Nicholas Said, Muhammad Ali Ben Said, got a good education. He basically went to a boarding school where he learned Arabic, he learned the Quran. If he had continued his studies, he might have learned astronomy, mathematics, Turkish. Those were some of the things that you would learn in the schools if you were lucky to be in the elite, which he was. But, I said if he had continued his education, he didn't, because one day he and some of his friends decided to go on a hunting trip in the northern part of the country. Um, his mother begged him not to go. She said, "Oh, there were these, these bandits that might rove through from the Sahara Desert. This is, bordering on the Sahara Desert. They might rove through and kidnap you and sell you as a slave." Um, well, that is actually precisely what happened. A band of um, Tuareg bandits who came from the Sahara. The Tuaregs are the kind of, they are the people that George Lucas um, sort of developed his Desert Raiders and Star Wars on. They were very well known for kidnapping, for raiding territories, and for selling people as slaves further on down the market. Um, he was forced to walk 2,000 miles across the Sahara in bare feet. Um, with just a chain of people who were purchased along the way and everything. And at the end of this journey, he was kept by the slave driver at that time. He was kept to work in his fields as a field worker, doing manual labor that he had never done before. He was about maybe 13, 14 years old at the time. And most peasants would be working by then, but he grew up in a fairly privileged family. This was the kind of work that slaves did for him. He didn't do it himself. And so every day he was beaten by his slave master, who was a slave himself. He whipped and beat him, saying, you got to do this work. And so finally, this has lasted for 2 or 3 weeks. Finally, after 2 or 3 weeks, he went to his master and he said, this stuff isn't working out for me. He says, this is, I'm beaten all the time. I'm not getting good food. I think you should sell me to somebody else. Sell me to a Turk or sell me to an Egyptian. Because Turks and Egyptians had very good, they had a very good reputation for treating their slaves well. Indeed, the Turks had a reputation for giving their slaves allowances that would allow them to buy freedom after a certain amount of time. It was almost treating them almost as if they're indentured servants rather than slaves. He says something to a Turk, and and if a slave in the United States at that time had said the same thing, you can imagine the result. But under Islam, and this is one of many differences between slavery in that part of the world and slavery in the Americas at the time. Under Islam, slaves had a legal right to ask for better improvement, legal right to ask to be sold to somebody else. The slave owner had no responsibility, no duty to follow that, to agree with their requests, but at least they had the right to hear the request without any reprisal. So the slave owner actually did agree to that request. It's a little more complicated even than that, which I can get into later. But eventually, Nicholas Said ended up in the employee of a Turk who taught him the art of tobacco serving, which was a very, very important thing at the time. It was like serving tea in China or Japan. It included a lot of ritual. Tobacco was served when important matters were to be discussed among people. It was served at business meetings, served at diplomatic meetings. So this was a very key high status for a slave to have at that time. and being served to, being sold to a Turk, he was getting an allowance that he could eventually theoretically use to pay off, to pay for his freedom. But he was sold first to before that chance to get freedom came. He was sold to a Turk. He was sold to the Turkish foreign minister, and ended up in Constantinople and Istanbul, where he served the Turkish foreign minister, Fuad Pasha, seen here, who was at that time, this is right on the eve of the Crimean War. At that time, he was negotiating with the French, the Russians, and the English to kind of stave off the war. It was really Russia and France were each pressuring Turkey to do their own, follow their own bidding. Turkey was trying to walk a tightrope between the two, which is what eventually led to the war. But during these negotiations, Fuad Pasha was spending a lot of time with the ambassadors from the other countries, including this gentleman who is Alexander Menshikov, a prince from Russia, who saw Nicholas Said and was very impressed with him. Nicholas Said, by this time, could speak 4 languages. He could speak Arabic, Turkish, and the 2 languages that his parents spoke at home, Mandara and Kanuri. So he was very impressed with him. He thought he was a very intelligent guy. So he actually bought him from the Turkish foreign ministry, took him up to Russia, and set him free, because, which is what Russians had. There was actually a kind of precedent for this that had been set in the days of Peter the Great. Seen here back in 1700, Peter the Great sent a request to his people in Constantinople, bring me some promising, intelligent young Africans. One of the Africans that was brought to him was Abram Ganibal, this boy seen here. This is when he was 12 years old at a battle between Russia and Sweden. And so Peter the Great brought him up almost like a godson, and trained him in military arts. And he eventually became the 3rd highest commander of the Russian army. This is in the 1700s. This is about, close to 200 years before we had an African general in our army, African-American general. So the Russians had a habit, had a policy of doing this, of buying and setting free, promising slaves. Nicholas Said spent the next 5 years following a Russian prince, serving as an aide to a Russian prince around all Europe. During that time, he was, they would go to Germany and Austria in the fall, Italy in the winter, France in the spring, England in the summer, and then back to Germany and Austria. They would do a circle loop around the continent. And during that time, Nicholas Said was picking up all of the languages of the countries that he went to: Russian, German, Italian, French, English. He already spoke Turkish, Arabic, Kanuri, Mandara. And he would continue to try to speak. He learned biblical Arabic, he learned Hebrew, Armenian. So he was really a magnet for languages. He was very skilled guy when it came into that. But finally, at the end of 6 years, he had agreed to work for the Russians for 5 years, and he worked for 6. And finally, they got to England one summer, and he said, "Hey, I'd really like to get back to Africa." And he and his employer, his employer was very sad to see him go, really begged him to stay, but in the end gave him leave. But before he got on a boat to get to Africa, oh, and I should say that during his travels, he met the likes of Louis Napoleon here, Queen Victoria, and Tsar Nicholas I, who was his indirect namesake. Um, that's when he took on the name Nicholas. But during but after he was let go in England, a Dutch count approached him and said, "Hey, I'm about to go on a honeymoon to the Americas. I'm marrying this English woman, and I want to go all around the Americas. I want an aide to be with me. How about you?" And Nicholas Said said he wanted to go to Africa, but his love of adventure trumped that feeling, and he decided to go to the Americas. After a few adventures, he ended up in Detroit in 1860, and this is one reason that I've been talking to several roundtables in Michigan because Michigan was the first place he really landed on his journeys here. He and he landed here right on the eve of the Civil War. Within it was probably about 2 months after he moved to Detroit, the war began. His records indicate that he immediately went down to a local recruiting office, thought he would be able to join the army, but unfortunately at that time, the army was for whites only. He was rejected. He was said they told him, well, you can work in our kitchens if you want. It's a civilian volunteer, but yeah, no, you can't go out to fight. Which I think stunned him. His father was a fighter. He knew of generals in the armies of Russia and France with African backgrounds. Napoleon had a French African general. He knew that other countries were employing soldiers, but he was pretty amazed that the United States wasn't. But he did take a job. He figured that he wanted to do something good for people. So he went to a local private school that had been organized by the African American community in Detroit. There was a public school which was taught by whites. The Detroit School Board refused to hire Black teachers, but they did have the Black community formed its own private school. He taught there, teaching French, it was because French was a very valuable commodity, being right in a city that was right across the river from Canada. So, unfortunately, in 1863, there was a large race riot in Detroit. White crowd went through the African American community, burned down a lot of buildings, beat a lot of people up. There were only 2 deaths, but a lot of people were injured. A lot of people were homeless because of the fires. The school building where Nicholas Said was burned down, where he taught. So, but right about that time also, the 54th and the Massachusetts was sending people to cities throughout the North, trying to recruit African Americans to fight in the army, to fight in the 54th Regiment. They were the first Northern regiment to do this. There were actually a couple of Union regiments in the South. Union regiments. Composed of freed slaves in the South. But this is the first one that was composed of African American freemen from the North. He went to Boston, joined a lot of people, got on the recruitment train, went to Boston to join the 55th Massachusetts, The 54th was full up by the time he got there. So the 55th was composed, and he became a sergeant very quickly in the 55th. At the same time that, that the 54th was and the 55th were fighting against the Confederates, against the South, for trying to free the slaves. There were also a lot of conflicts with the North. They felt, for good reason, that they were not taken seriously by the North. They weren't offered the same pay as a Northern recruit. Black soldiers were offered $7 a month, whatever their rank, whether they were a private, a corporal, a sergeant, sergeant major, whatever their rank, whereas white soldiers were, the lowliest private was offered almost twice as much as a black soldier, and it just went up from there. I stopped at sergeant major because they weren't allowed to be anything higher than sergeant major. They weren't allowed to have any commissioned rank at that time. No lieutenants, no captains. That was, they were all totally in control of white officers. And this led, especially the money issue, led to a lot of protests. And they would say, this isn't about the money. This isn't about, you'd be a fool to go into battle for $13 a month, less than, if that was all it was about. This is about equality. This is about, wanting to be treated equally as other soldiers and wanting to be viewed equally as that. So this led to a lot of protests at the same time as they were on the battlefield. So here's a famous picture of the 54th Massachusetts, the famous one, the one depicted in the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, and probably my favorite Civil War film. Here's their attack on Fort Wagner. The 55th came, and they attacked Fort Wagner knowing it would be a suicide march, basically. A white regiment had attacked just a week before and hadn't even made it to the fort walls. But, they were just severely cut up by the Confederate firepower. The 54th made it over the walls, but just barely before they were turned back. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Confederates, unlike the previous attack, which only had a dozen or so Confederate casualties, but they had hundreds of casualties themselves. They were, after that, after two failed attempts, the Army decided that they were going to build trenches to the fort, and from those trenches, they were going to attack the fort. And this was what Nicholas Said and his soldiers from the 55th, this is one of their first tasks, getting to the front lines. They eventually took over the fort. The Confederates, realizing what was going to happen, evacuated about 2 months after inflicting such heavy casualties on the 54th. The 55th and other troops down there also helped establish a gun turret in the middle of a swamp called the Swamp Angel that was capable of firing shots 5 miles into Charleston, South Carolina, which caused little damage, but was a really important morale booster for the North, because finally they were able to. The Charleston is where the war began, was where, the city fired on Fort Sumter, and so now they're able to fire on Charleston. So it was a morale booster. And as the war went on, the 55th and the 54th both got into more battles, both in the Carolinas and Georgia. But during all this time, they had refused to take any pay. They had refused, saying, if you're not going to pay us equally to white soldiers, you're not going to pay us at all. We're just going to do it, to prove who we are, and in the hopes that eventually you'll treat us equally. And that was true for about a year, that they were, really protesting that this was causing real hardships at home. Families depending on them to send their paychecks home were not getting the money that they were hoping for. This was really a disturbing experience for the soldiers on the field. So finally, they did things like sacking up their rifles and refusing to fight. Things that were considered mutinous at the time, when one of Nicholas Said's own soldiers was eventually shot to death and executed for mutiny. Something which probably which had a deep effect on him and all the soldiers that were around him. Eventually, they did get equal pay. Their protests did work, and they were among the first troops to enter the city of Charleston when it was liberated by the Union. Now, after the Civil War, Nicholas Said stayed in the South. He stayed in the South, deciding that he was going to teach the children of freed slaves how to read and write. And so he became a teacher at freedmen's schools in Georgia, in Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. He also became one of the nation's first black voting registrars in the Charleston district, signing up several hundred slaves freed slaves to vote. And he gave lectures throughout the area. Lectures that drew both white and black audiences, because there was a lot of curiosity about Africa at the time. This is at a time when Henry Livingston and Stanley were in Africa and were sending reports back. And so he wrote on that, and he basically, his basic theme of his talks about Africa was about the accomplishments that can be achieved by the African. So that is that's the basic rundown of my book. Yep. So, yeah. So I guess, I'd be happy to hear if there are any questions or anything.
Yes, I can.